Hello and welcome to ENCORE. In today's show, we're talking about death.
Corpses, corpses, rotting in a tree. They're inanimate objects and they won't hurt me.
Vivacious, witty and thoroughly alive, Caitlin Doughty is my guest today. The author of Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, she's written about her experience as a mortician in all its gory and sometimes glorious detail. From tribal burial rites to make-up tips for corpses, she takes us gently by the hand into the world of the deceased. Let's go and meet her. Caitlin Doughty, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'd like to start with your book, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. It's part memoir, part manual, part historical study. I wanted to know, what were you aiming at with this book and who was it for?
Well, it's for anyone who plans on dying or doesn't plan on dying but is going to die, because we all do. And that was exactly the idea. It was trying to combine memoir and history, because I think with something like death, that's such a difficult subject, it's hard to get people to hear the hard facts about what happens during a cremation or how decomposition occurs. So you kind of have to have a spoonful of sugar to help the dark medicine go down.
Okay, and in the course of your research for this book, you touch on many different cultural differences that could be tribal rituals or religious practices or things related to geography. What were the most astonishing or surprising things you chanced upon?
Well, what's so interesting to me is that everyone around the world, in a way, wants to mourn their dead and wants to take care of their dead in some way. But for the people of Tibet, it's having the body laid out for vultures. In this tribe I talked about called the Wari, an indigenous tribe in Brazil, it's consuming their dead as a mortuary ritual. And when we think about those things in the West, no thank you. But when they discuss them and when you hear firsthand accounts, it's beautiful and it's meaningful and it's actually much more engaged than a lot of what we do in the West.
Now, exactly, he's talking about this Western culture that we come from and that we know the best. Perhaps I realised reading your book that I am a perfect example of someone who kind of avoids talking about death. I try and, a bit adverse to it. Where do you think this behaviour comes from? Why are we like that?
Well, it's not your fault, first of all. People apologize all the time for being a death denier, but you grew up in a culture. By the time you were born, you had inherited this fear of death and this avoidance of death. And I really think that it came from both the funeral industry and the public. World War I, the Civil War in the United States, these were really violent conflicts, and people wanted to avoid death more than they had in the past. So the funeral industry, which used to just be the guy who sold you the coffin and was also a bricklayer and a dentist and a lamplighter, came in and said, we can take your body and we can do all this for you and you can just pay us. And the public said, okay, great, let's do that. And that was great at the time, but what's happened is that we're now almost entirely divorced from death. The funeral industry will come in, take the body after death, and many families don't see it, don't interact with it. And when you don't see the actual dead body, death can seem a little less real to you.
So it's very much an out of sight, out of mind approach. But then on the other hand, we do have a kind of love-hate relationship, because there is a fascination in popular culture with morbid things, the spectacle of the skeletons here in the catacombs in Paris, and the wildly successful Bodyworks exhibition put together by Gunther von Hagen. Now that's received a record number of visitors. How can we explain that?
I think it's one of the biggest traveling tourist attractions in the world is Body Worlds. I think that when you're divorced from death in the way that we are, we're desperate for some kind of connection. The way that we obsess over celebrity deaths, the way that we're interested in horror or zombies, the way we go to Body Worlds, it becomes strange and warped and a titillation in a way, because we don't see many natural dead bodies in naturally how they are. So we have to go to get that connection somewhere.
And go and see them. Well, speaking of Bodyworks, we can take a look at a few reactions from people at the permanent exhibit in Berlin. This is the creator of the show.
Most of our visitors have a very deep and emotional experience when they see this exhibition and they're in front of the bodies. You're looking at dead bodies, but what we discover is ourselves.
Looking at an unearthed body was really disgusting. worms had eaten away at it, and I told myself I didn't want that. I also inquired about cremation. And when you see how the bodies are burned in a crematorium, it's not really great either. And one day, I saw this show, and I told myself, this is what I wanted.
So we've got everything from the squeamish to people who are at peace with their death. Are these the kind of reactions you encounter in your work?
Absolutely. That last gentleman was a really interesting example because he had really thought about it and made the choice to donate to Body Worlds. He wants his body to be displayed for people to come see him. And that thought process of figuring out what you actually want is really important. You may be afraid of being in the cold ground. You may be afraid of fire. You may be horrified by a spectacle of the body worlds, or you may find extreme comfort in any of those. And it's really just about the process of looking at the different ones, understanding them, and then going, okay, this one makes me comfy.
Okay, so taking control of your own death. Now, I want to come back to the book. It's been translated into French. It's called Chronique de mon crématorium in French. Now, this is a country where cremation was very, very rare until, I mean, even 20 years ago, only 10% of people were cremated in France. And when the Père Lachaise cemetery, the crematorium, within the cemetery, opened in 1889, they only did 50 deaths. They only did 50 cremations. That figure's gone up since then, but there is still a bit of a taboo. Why do you think that is, and do you think it's changed?
Well, it wasn't until the early 60s that the Pope said it was even okay to have cremation at all. So it's really a pretty modern conceit among Christianity and Catholicism to be allowed to cremate. And it takes, everything with death moves very slowly. It's a push that takes a long time. So the more that people know about cremation, the more that people believe that there's not enough room to bury people, or we value cemeteries less, because there's always room for more cemeteries if we value it. We don't need to put in a giant box store. We don't need to put in a department store. We could make that a cemetery, but if we just don't value visiting cemeteries that much anymore, and we're okay religiously with cremation, and it's cheaper, that's what more people are going to choose.
Okay, now speaking of your experience in the cremation world, the industry, what is the strangest request you've ever received from a family or from perhaps a person in their will about the final process?
That's interesting. I didn't actually perform this cremation, but my boss at the first place I worked told me that a gentleman wanted a massive Darth Vader helmet put on as he was cremated, which... ask for those sort of things. If you want, because we're increasingly secular, we have less ritual around death. So people feel like they can't be involved. But you can go in, you can witness the cremation take place. You can have Darth Vader helmets on. You can have full outfits on. You can have anything that makes you feel like it's something the person would have wanted. And you should ask for those things, absolutely.
Okay, one to bear in mind. Now, many people see the funeral industry as traditional, dusty and old-fashioned, but Caitlin's brought it into the 20th century with the creation of a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician. Let's take a look at this clip where she advises people on how to speak to their parents about death.
Step one is the most important of all the steps, and that's to believe that talking about death is the right thing to do. Pick up your sword of righteousness, I don't have a sword, so this is a butter knife, and go into battle facing down your mortality. If you don't have the strength of your convictions, or just don't think it's that important to talk about, the conversation is over before it even starts.
Now, your YouTube channel is very, very successful, very popular, tens of thousands of subscribers. Why do you think that is? I mean, who's engaging with this?
Well, people are just desperate to talk about death. And because we live in a world where we feel like we should have all the information we want at our Google fingertips any second of the day, but it's still hard to find information about death online and what really goes on behind the scenes. So when I started the web series, people were just interested in this information. The perception is that we don't want to talk about death. But if I go to a party, all people want to talk to me about is the grossest thing I've ever seen, how a cremation happens. They want that information. So the web series is just kind of taking that party to the internet.
Okay. Now, in the book, you talk about a concept that you had as a younger person, well, as a child, I think it was, la belle mort, beautiful death. And this is a concept that you slightly backpedaled on. You changed your mind about that. Today, what would your manifesto be for the perfect kind of death?
I think the perfect kind of death is one with a lot of involvement from friends and family. So a lot of our modern ideas about death, especially with the funeral industry, is more creativity, bigger memorial service, more options for personalization. But when it comes down to it, what we're missing is not more things to buy around death. It's that engagement. It's actually sitting with the body and being with the body and washing the body and shrouding the body, or going with it to the crematory or to the cemetery, and just feeling connected to the ritual and to the process. And that's cheap. It's simple. It doesn't cost any money to have that engagement, but it's so valuable, and I think it really helps the grieving process.
Now, what's very uplifting in your story, in your book, that there are a few exhilarating moments. There are moments where you say you feel very alive, you appreciate your life. What did working around death teach you about life?
What's so interesting is that sometimes when I felt most alive were the grossest moments, when a body was decomposed or there was some horrible mishap. But for some reason, being around death and being around reality in that way, I felt like I was breathing rarefied air. I felt like I was in a place that most people don't get to see, and that I wish most people could see. I would invite everyone back into the crematory if I could and say, join me, take a look at this. So as this dead body is, you too will be.
So a very life-affirming experience.
It is, and
in a
it's
way.
you wouldn't think, but it really is.
Yeah. Well, Caitlin Doughty, that's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for being with us. I'd just like to remind you that Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is already available in English and now in a French translation, Chronique de mon crématorium. We'll leave you with one of Caitlin's favourite films, the 2008 movie Departures. Caitlin, Departures, why is this a favourite?
Because it is the realistic depiction of death. It's a Japanese man who comes back to his hometown and sees what it's really like to work as a death worker. And it's totally realistic and heart-wrenching and beautiful.
Okay, let's take a look at that then. Remember, you can get more news on our website. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. There's more news coming up on France 24 after this.